Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Josh Maxfield, and I'm Associate General Counsel at Garmin. Been at Garmin coming up on 14 years. I was just talking to Susan and Rodney about my time previously with Posinelli, so reminiscing about those days. My role at Garmin includes public policy and government relations, and been spending more of my time on that in recent years, mostly at the federal level, but a little bit at the state level too. And recently was asked by Ryan and team if I would chair the policy committee for KC Tech Council, and I was honored to be asked to do that, and I'm honored to be in that role now. I think there's a lot of really exciting things going on on the policy side at KC Tech Council, and happy to be a part of that. I will turn it over to the main presenters here today, Susan Henderson Moore and Rodney Gray. Susan and Rodney are both with the Posinelli law firm. They're both based in Jefferson City, and both have been registered lobbyists for several years, and have a lot of experience lobbying for issues in Jefferson City, so on the Missouri side. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Susan and Rodney, who I think are together in the same office. So that's kind of you don't see that very often these days.
There's only 4 of us or 5 of us in the office, so it makes it a little less risky than for most folks.
Take it away, please, Susan and Rodney.
Okay, so I'll introduce myself first. I'm Susan. My background, I went to the University of Missouri. I was a nonpartisan attorney for the Missouri Senate for several years before this guy recruited me. And I've been with the firm 10 years now in the public policy role. So although I have obviously been an attorney my entire career, I've never done the traditional things. I've always been in this political and policy world. So that's my background.
Yeah, I've been here in Jefferson City a little longer than Susan, but I did go to the University of Missouri Law School, did a stint at the Department of Transportation, eventually wound up at Hendren Andre, which was then the largest law firm in Jefferson City with a whopping 12 people. And we were acquired by Posinelli in 2010. I then had the good foresight to recruit Susan, and we've been doing this for various clients for the last 10 years. We're kind of the intersection of where the law and policy meet. So that's the kind of things that we do. We have a myriad of different things that we do on behalf of clients in Jefferson City. Not all are just in front of the state legislature. A lot of executive branch interaction as well. You want me to just go ahead and dive into the legislative process a little bit here? Are we ready for that?
We're ready. Thank you.
Okay. So for those of you who are familiar or not familiar out there, in Missouri, I'd say we're somewhat similar to most legislative processes. The legislature meets generally every year from from January through mid-May, early January through mid-May. Have a session every year. They do not build upon each other. What's done in one session doesn't carry over to the next. I think one of the things that's maybe a little different about Missouri than some other states, and some of you are probably familiar with Kansas, is in Missouri we don't have any kind of measuring timelines that anything has to be done at a certain time or it's dead. And so that leaves us with the ability or vulnerability, as it may be, that any and all issues are alive until the very last day of the session.
We're the Wild West of legislating.
Yes, indeed. And we found that out this year. As our session went, as everybody knows, everything was interrupted by the COVID circumstances. And in the middle of Missouri, the legislature took 6 weeks off and then came back and finished their business, including a state budget, in about 3 weeks. That was quite a spectacle.
And I would say because of that break, you know, there's always a very small percentage of provisions and bills that pass. This is an estimate, but on average, you're at about 5 to 10% of things that make it. And this year we had, not including budget bills, we only had 32 bills out of about 2,200 that made it across the finish line, just because when they came back, a good portion of their time was spent doing the budget, which they're required to do per the Constitution. And then, you know, the rest of it was the substantive bills. So it was definitely a strange session in that sense. And just to kind of, I know that there's probably like a wide gamut of people of who's familiar with lobbying and what we do. So I kind of break it down into 3 big categories. Educating legislators on issues, because obviously they come from a wide variety of backgrounds, everything, you know, from attorneys to business owners to farmers, teachers. And so like all of us, you know, they have things that they are familiar with and issues that are totally new to them. So, and I learn something every year that I never thought I'd learn about because of a client's needs. And so there's that, and there's proactively getting things across the finish line that people like you guys want. And then there's making sure that bad things don't happen. So I would say those are kind of the main categories of what we do. So
Yeah, in front of the legislature, I would say that's right. There's also then the oftentimes interaction with either the governor's office or various agencies on rules interpretations, pending rules. It's a style of somewhere between administrative law and executive branch lobbying that occurs on a semi-regular basis as well.
So that being said, talking about the short session we have, and if anybody has questions, I know Ryan has the capability of seeing if folks have anything to ask. Feel free to interrupt if it makes sense to ask the question now versus waiting. With the limited number that we have, they did do some things that I would consider to be, you know, at least tech related, even if it's not some of the more, you know, classic areas. So one thing, an example of things that we have proactively worked on your all's behalf before is the computer science issue, allowing it to be treated as a math and science credit for purposes of high school graduation. That was a big one that was pretty challenging due to some resistance from the education establishment, but that was one that we worked on a couple years ago. There wasn't as much in the education space this year, just in general. There wasn't because of the time constraints. So I would say, actually some of the things, especially in the healthcare, you could definitely see where they had at least an attempt to keep things in response to COVID and kind of COVID related when they came back. And so a couple things that they passed were to, I guess, allow for the expansion of remote pharmacy, particularly in the healthcare space. Obviously, everybody can see the growing importance of telehealth and the healthcare services under the current conditions. So the remote pharmacies in particular, they're looking at the issues where, you know, you might not have the actual pharmacist there, but as long as you have the tech and you have the ability to be live with the pharmacist, the tech can go ahead and dispense that. So obviously, particularly for rural areas where pharmacies are continuing to not exist in some of those communities, it's allowing people to have that healthcare more. And another one that was definitely, I guess you could say, went to the top of the pile after when they came back from the COVID situation is obviously everybody is aware of the restrictions for long-term care facilities and people going to visit. And so there was a provision that allows residents or the resident's family, obviously with their permission, to have electronic monitoring devices put in the room, which obviously is, you know, a lot more popular since people aren't able to check in on their families now. So that took some, obviously some pretty strong negotiations with the nursing homes who had concerns about liability. on that issue, just providing people that connection through, that technology that they would not have otherwise been allowed to have. Just big picture on broadband, which Rodney will talk about, I think will continue to be something that Missouri, frankly struggles with, but they're addressing. And they, one of the things they did was to extend the broadband program. It was going to expire next year, and now it will be in continuation for that grant program and that access funding until 2027. So that was one. And then, I did forget one other health initiative. There was quite a few provisions that we did relating to abuse and sexual abuse and different things like that with children. And so they now have established a statewide telehealth network for those forensic exams of victims. So that was another kind of thing in the healthcare space that they did. And then lastly, as we all know, state government is woefully behind when it comes to their programs and technology. That being said, they are inching, I guess you could say, towards trying to create, more access and make services easier. So they did pass provision aligned for electronic notaries and for remote driver's license renewal. And then also allowing Children's Division, which is in social services, to have exchange of information about reports with other agencies. So, I mean, definitely far, far from big picture issues and improvement of systems that probably all of us, and most definitely you all, would be interested in seeing, but at least some incremental changes. So of the 32 bills, that's kind of the stuff that might be considered in the tech space that actually made it across the finish line. The governor has until July 14th to sign bills, and most of them, unless they have an emergency clause, become effective at the end of August. So that's kind of the big picture of what happened.
I think it left a few issues, illuminated a few issues that will still be talked about as we head into 2021. I think probably not just in Missouri, but everywhere. I think as people struggle to figure out how to provide adequate schooling and education, I think that the access to broadband, not only on a rural basis, but also in a lot of impoverished students, made that a real difficult situation for educators. And I think you continue to see that. And it's interesting. Last night, our local school district in Columbia, Missouri, announced that students could attend either the traditional 5-day school or virtual school beginning in the fall. We'll see how well that works. But I think that the access to broadband is going to continue to be an issue. And I think it's one that's interesting because I don't think government really thought that this was theirs to deal with. It had been mostly, private companies implementation. So now it seems a little more of has been thrust upon their plate. Second, I think telehealth is here to stay. I think everybody's pretty happy with the results. Or I think, in the medical field, as in others, there's some turf issues that go on. Of this whole situation.
And one thing to add as to why legislation would be potentially necessary on that, because we are under a state of emergency, it gives the governor and the executive branch power to waive a lot of statutory and regulatory requirements. And like Rodney said, obviously, you've got fights between doctors and nurse practitioners and whatever. And so those fights can't go on when the governor has the ability to simply waive rules. And so the use of telehealth is, I guess you could say, far less regulated right now under the state of emergency than it normally is. To be able to continue to do that in the form that it is without the state of emergency, there would have to be some legal changes. But I think that there is definitely an acknowledgement amongst the administration and others that a good portion of these changes are good and probably
Should be.
need to stay. So like I said, that's when the legislature, comes back into play to make it permanent.
Kind of the follow-up on the education piece is, we're obviously real high levels of unemployment right now. There's going to have to be some kind of a train going through Jefferson City, some type of workforce development initiatives that likely are going to involve more virtual learning than traditional, sit in a chair in a classroom type operation. What those are going to be and what those are going to be like, I think people are working on, but I think it's a real challenge out there. It's one thing I think the governor will focus on that. He's been trying to focus on workforce development before he headed into some other issues here recently.
Another thing that I would add too, and Rodney and I were talking and getting ready for this, is that because of the COVID situation, government is not, they don't think as long-term. I guess in some ways they don't have the luxury of planning and thinking as long-term as those of you in private industry. So, in the last few months, it has definitely been a reactionary process in dealing with the immediacy of things. So I think we were talking, I think it's going to be a few months before we really see kind of the bigger picture ideas and plans about what needs to be done to come out of all of this.
Yeah, it's really hard to see how much in regards to new policy gets implemented. I would say, and we're in a real political season here in the summer. It may not appear that way yet, but I think there's going to be a wild spree of spending here in the next 6 weeks for the August primaries. And maybe post that, we'll start to see, maybe in Labor Day, after Labor Day, people kind of wake up, we'll start to see some new policy initiatives. But right now, for the most part, legislators, bureaucrats, if you will, just kind of have their heads, under the pillow trying to make sure everything works out all right. So we have questions, Ryan, or do you want us to jump on into what the political landscape looks like?
Yeah, let's jump in. And again, if you have questions, please submit those into the Q&A function there, and we will make sure to get those at the end of the webinar.
Okay.
So Missouri, unlike Kansas, this is a big year. Besides the presidential election, 5 of the 6 statewide officials in Missouri, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and state treasurer are all up for election. Along with that, half of the Missouri Senate, which is 17 seats, of which we are guaranteed that 11 of those 17 will be new because we have term limits. And then all of the House of Representatives will be up as well. And we have quite a mishmash of them, 163. We're the 4th largest house in the country.
Too big.
So we're going to have, why I mentioned the August primaries, there's of those 11 new seats for sure, I think 10 of them are going to be decided in primaries, either Republican or Democrat across the state. Several of those are in the Kansas City area, 3 or 4 to be exact. So the August season, while it may not seem as important as perhaps the gubernatorial and presidential, probably pretty important as to the actual workings of the legislature in Jefferson City.
Obviously, I think probably everyone's fairly familiar with the fact that Missouri is a very Republican state politically. Obviously, there will be some changes, but the overall general dynamic and numbers are not going to shift significantly. So we will still, have a majority Republican in both houses. So.
Yeah, I think if you were to realistically look at the 17 possible races in the Senate, there's only 2 that are really Republican and Democratic, that really are going to go head to head. The House a little more so than that. Mm-hmm. And then I think the only statewide that's a possible horse race is that for governor, where current state auditor Nicole Galloway could give Governor Parson a run for his money, but he's still the front runner at this juncture.
I guess Ryan had talked about, I guess the view of you all engaging not only policy-wise with legislators, but then also politically as well. And just to kind of throw out a couple thoughts and tips, I guess. When it comes to the policy side, I would say that organizations like this definitely serve a function, particularly when you're supporting the bigger picture issues, where a group can coalesce around it, and especially one thing that we talk about that you all might not be as cognizant of is when it comes to state politics, Kansas City is really playing catch up. St. Louis has always been a stronger voice in Jeff City and historically. And so I think to have organizations like the KC Tech Council to show up and represent the Kansas City side is a positive thing. I think when you get down into specific legislation or really more into the specifics, that's where people like Rodney and I come in to play, because it just requires a lot more day-to-day interaction, boots on the ground, I would say. So I would say knowing your audience is very important, and knowing the person's background and their perspective and where they're coming from. And so those are kind of the things on the policy side, big picture, without anybody having a specific question. So hopefully you guys do. And then we were talking politically about, if your company was going to engage, one thing that I think people who aren't in our business have a hard time doing is disconnecting your personal political beliefs with what is the best candidate to support for your organization, which those might not always align. Rodney's giggles. So
I'd say that's a very true statement.
So those are just some things to think about and some thoughts to throw out in case anybody might have a question, or if that spawns any conversation. So
There was a quick question, guys, let me throw out here too.
Yeah.
Yes, here, are there any changes to the legislative process caused by COVID-19 that you could see being implemented long term?
That's a good question. I'm just thinking about how they did things during the 3 weeks. I think that by and large, while they utilized social distancing, at least for a period of that time, it didn't end up quite like the Lake of the Ozarks. But I don't think we will see remote voting or anything like that. I think that they view that the threats to security and vote along those lines and fraudulent votes and all of those things are more dangerous than the health issues as the actual legislatures interact. I mean, we had virtual hearing type where you could.
I was going to say, so our Senate in particular is very traditional, very old school, I guess you could say, in the way they conduct their business, to the point where you have not even been able to listen or watch a committee hearing online until COVID. So that being said, they were kind of forced into that.
That might continue for
and
them.
I could see that continuing, which I know to you all seems just like, wow, that's a big change, but it actually
But even
is.
but even with that, and while the House has had video and audio of their floor debates for, I don't know, several years now, the Senate has refused. And even during this COVID situation, still didn't allow it. So if you chose to, you had either listen or you could attend by sitting in the gallery.
Got another question here from Facebook. Despite the economic challenges, many tech companies are still hiring. Do you think the tech industry could play a role in those workforce development initiatives in Missouri?
I think they could. Yeah, I think they could. And the interaction there, I would suggest if they want to be involved, would be probably 2 or 3 different ways. One with the governor's office, or via Zora Mulligan, who's the head of higher education and workforce development. She's director there. I think they would be very open to those if people have innovative ideas that they could bring to that space.
That being said, we kind of go back to state government not being the most, progressive or forward-thinking entity. I think it's one where you all, as the Tech Council or whatever group, I think you're going to need to come to them with some formulated ideas, because I think thinking out of the box in this space is really tough for them.
Yeah, just dropping it on their doorstep and hoping they pick it up and run with it won't happen. I mean, you have to actually kick the door down and show them how it will work and give them some opportunity to see how it can be successful, because as Susan pointed out, most of the time they spend just trying to grind through the regular day. I mean, as we look out from our office, I mean, if there is a third of the state workers that are actually back in their offices, that's a generous estimation.
Yeah.
We
And
got a
I would
couple
say
more in
too,
here,
oh,
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Brian.
So we got a couple more in here too. I'm gonna try to get to them before we close out here at 30 past the
Yeah.
hour. Another one from Facebook: does the reduction of funding for Missouri Technology Corporation indicate a lack of interest in supporting tech companies in the industry?
So from what we've learned about that, either, I guess you could say, behind the scenes, part of it is, the governor is, I guess you could say, forced into the situation of having to withhold. And although the budget is much larger, the places where he can get money from general revenue is pretty limited. And so although I hate to say this from, things that I think are worthwhile, but from just a budgetary standpoint, MTC is kind of low-hanging fruit.
And just
Maybe you can put that in a different way.
I'm going to put it in a little perspective. So the governor's had to withhold, just in the last month, $440 million, and almost a third of that now has come from K-12, and another probably third from higher ed. So while I recognize that the Tech Council is close to everybody's heart, I think it's like the $3 million. So as you look at that in perspective of 440, while it's important to its constituency, there are other bigger fish that the governor has to deal with, at least right now.
And I would also say too, I mean, I know that in years past, when the governor was a legislator and he was supportive of MTC in their efforts, I think also that there has been a request and kind of a push from the new director to have kind of more of a game plan and a bigger picture plan, and more specificity about, how they can be impactful. So I know that request has been made of him, and I know he just got started before the money was withheld. So, so that's those two things combined. I think I wouldn't say that it is a lack of support for them conceptually. I think a lot of it's just more circumstantial.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, there's two questions we'll try to get to them here in the last couple of minutes. Let me answer them pretty quickly, but this may be more of a federal question, but there could be implications at the state level. But do you think there are any infrastructure changes in the financial industry that would be prompted by COVID? Specifically, PPP was so difficult to roll out. Would there be any infrastructure and technology changes that could make such a rollout much easier in the future? Anything at the state level that would be in those lines?
It's hard to see. I mean, that the rollout was primarily through Treasury and the banking system. And so I think those people that, didn't have prior relations there with banking institutions made it a little difficult. I don't know that I see state government stepping into that role.
Makes sense. And another one from Josh Maxfield with Garmin. Kansas is passing a bill that would say businesses who are following COVID-19 guidance from health agencies will be immune from liability. Are there any discussions about this on the Missouri side?
That's a really good question.
Yes.
It was proposed when they came back. It did not pass. And actually, the version that they talked about when they came back was specifically for, I guess you could say, the very healthcare related, workers, providers. But I know that obviously other states are looking more at of the bigger picture for businesses of liability protection. That being said, they did not get it across the finish line. I know that requests have been made of the governor's office to do it via executive order. However, the governor's office and his legal staff don't feel like under Missouri law that they have the ability to do it legally, to provide that. And so it would need to be done legislatively. I think it's the Missouri Chamber has been very active on making a push to have that be an issue potentially for a special session.
Which we think if they're going to do, it's looking more and more like if they do a special session, it'd probably be in September. The governor would have to call them back for that. But yeah, we think that's an issue. If there is going to be a special session, that issue will be, front and center.
Well, thank you guys. Policy is obviously very important to us, the Tech Council, and representing the industry at state and federal levels. It's great to have the two of you, the faces of those that represent us most often in Jefferson City. So thank you, not only for your advocacy on key issues like computer science, but continuing to represent the tech industry with our elected officials in Jefferson City. For those of you listening, if you didn't have a chance to ask a question but would still like to, feel free to reach out to me via email. Be happy to connect you with Rodney and Susan. Tell you from experience, they do an excellent job representing our interests in Jeff City, and appreciate having that tech voice there. So again, thank you everybody for taking the time to join us. Thank you, Rodney and Susan, for your expertise and sharing a quick recap of the legislative process in Missouri. We will continue these discussions, and I would say if you want to be more engaged in this process, even with the Tech Council, we do have an active policy committee that does meet fairly regularly during the session, but then as we gear up here for an election season, both at the state and federal level, it's going to be a very active policy second half of the year for us. So if you'd like to be further engaged and get more information on that issue, again, feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is just ryan@kctechcouncil.com, and there's information on our website as well. So we're 2 minutes past, so I'm going to have to close it down. But thank you again, guys, for taking the chance to speak to our group, and appreciate your expertise and representing us in Jeff City.